Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Memphis Mayhem, a story of the music that shook up the world, by David A. Less. Narrated by Chris Abernathy. Foreword, by Peter Guralnick. I wasn't a stranger to Memphis when I met David Less. I wasn't even a stranger to David Less. I'm not quite sure how or when we first met, but he was there to greet me when I returned to Memphis in 1980 to begin work on sweet soul music, and he has been there ever since. A tireless researcher, a valued colleague, the kind of friend you can always count on if you need any help. But don't worry, it's not all that serious. He's just as quick to share a joke. David knew everybody. I had other indispensable guides. I'm not going to name them here, they're all acknowledged in my book. But David was a stalwart from the start, as he would continue to be throughout the years. When the Smithsonian embarked upon what turned into the Rockin' Soul Project, ultimately it became a museum in Memphis rather than the exhibit in Washington, D.C. it was originally intended to be, it was David who proved to be the link to the community, not just because of all the contacts he had made over the years, but because of his deep-seated and empathetic feeling for both the music and the people. We collaborated happily on some of the early interviews. I don't know if you've ever worked with anyone interviewing a subject who is not necessarily pre-sold on the process, but believe me, it isn't easy. In fact, it's a lot easier for the two interviewers to step all over each other's feet. With David, it was always a joy. He was always there as a backup. He took the lead when necessary, which was often. He could be voluble, and he could be quiet. Whatever the situation called for, he was never anything less than a steady guiding hand. But I haven't even mentioned the comprehensive body of work he has put together on his own over the years, the scrupulously informed, modestly foundational, wide-ranging, and insightful interviews that form the basis for this book. Who else but David would recognize the integral importance of Fred Hutchins, Dub Jenkins, Thomas Pinkston, and Sunbeam Mitchell to telling the story of Memphis, not to mention Harmonica Frank's celebrated fish fries in David's own backyard. Everyone who has written about Memphis music in recent years has drawn on David's interviews, sometimes with suitable acknowledgement, other times not. I've always cherished the hope that the interviews themselves might be published someday as a kind of oral history of Memphis. But with Memphis Mayhem, David has delivered something even better. He has created his own warm, anecdotal history of Memphis, enlivened by a relaxed and rambling narrative style perfectly suited to its subject. Remember, in Memphis, the singer always lags behind the beat, and a Memphis-centric relish for contradiction, digression, and the unpredictable oddities and quiddities of human behavior. But most of all, the book is marked by a feeling for time and place, and the people that occupied it, in a world that David Less has known so long and so well, but that, like any true explorer, he is still discovering. Introduction. In its coverage of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Time magazine called Memphis a decaying Mississippi River town. True, the city was not then what it had been 50 years before, when William Christopher W.C. Handy began to notate the blues, but decaying? Some Memphians took more umbrage over this description of their hometown than the fact that the civil rights leader of a generation had just been murdered in their backyard. Memphis had a deserved reputation as a racist city, but it is also a place where black and white musicians traditionally made music together, both on stage and in recording studios. The home to murderers and thieves, artists and entrepreneurs, old money and extreme poverty, Memphis gave birth to music that changed the world. Memphis's tourism site promotes the city as the home of blues, soul, and rock and roll. To musicians and music lovers worldwide, it is the cradle of American music. If we imagine history as like a river, most actions by our planet's billions of inhabitants are only pebbles in the river, affecting only an individual's history. But when an event changes the history of humanity in a profound manner, it makes the river curve and bend. And that's what happened in Memphis. 3 times the course of history looped through the city to leave a lasting impression. In this place, long charged with interracial tensions, if not outright conflict, each of these events opened a door to bridging the divide between black and white America. In each case, once the door opened, it could never be closed again. During the first decade of the 20th century, local musician and composer W.C. Handy notated an African-American music he had heard traveling throughout the South. In 1909, he wrote a campaign song based on that music, which he later published as the Memphis Blues. Then in 1917, Handy introduced the rest of the world to the blues with the publication of the sheet music for his Beale Street Blues. Keep in mind that before the gramophone popularized recorded music around the time of World War I, printed sheet music was the farthest-reaching means of distributing songs. Beale Street Blues also gained wide popularity through its inclusion in the Broadway musical revue Schubert Gaieties of 1919. As a direct result of W.C. Handy's work, this regionally rooted Memphis-distilled musical form was disseminated internationally and became the bedrock of contemporary popular music. The second event that profoundly altered history also involved music. On a hot July evening in 1954, in a small, crowded recording studio, producer Sam Phillips and a teenaged Elvis Presley recorded songs that changed the world. Ethnomusicologists may debate whether the first rock and roll recording was Rocket 88 by Jackie Brinston and his Delta Cats, or Elvis's That's All Right, but most agree it happened in Sam Phillips's studio in Memphis. Some people said Elvis stole black music. I feel that the music was there for the taking. He heard it on the radio and possibly in clubs or on the streets. While he didn't learn it in the same way that contemporary African-American musicians did, school, families, parties, his feeling for the music justifies the performance. No one claims British musicians in the 1950s and 1960s stole American music when they commandeered it. Similarly, Elvis seized black music and mutated it into rock and roll. In the same way that W.C. Handy did not invent the blues, it is inconsequential whether these early Elvis sessions were the first rock and roll records. What is indisputable is their impact. According to Memphis rocker Larry Raspberry, who sang the indelible 1965 hit Keep On Dancing with his band The Gentrys, Elvis was the tributary of black music into white households. What followed from Elvis included a youth revolution that improved or at least changed race relations in America and ultimately produced a social shift more inclusive of young people and minorities. Coincidentally, the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka decision requiring public schools to integrate was adjudicated the same year as Elvis's first recording. Changes toward equality and civil rights, along with the rise to dominance of influence in popular culture of the young, may have ultimately happened without Elvis Presley. The dissemination of the blues may have happened without the work of W.C. Handy. But both these men and their activities were primary catalysts for musical, cultural, and social change. The fact that both lived in Memphis, a small southern city, is something more than coincidence. The third historically defining moment involving Memphis was the tragedy that brought to a climax our nation's long mistreatment and oppression of African Americans. When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead by a sniper on April 4, 1968, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, the violence and injustice of racial bigotry entered the homes of establishment America and the rest of the world in an undeniable manner. A change had been coming. Dr. King's death magnified the inevitability and righteousness of it. His murder forced the United States to face the challenges confronting black Americans in their slow, arduous climb toward equality of rights and opportunities. Ironically, Dr. King's death also signaled a divide in the city's music community that took years to overcome. Traditionally, legal segregation, church, schools, and social standing separated the races, but music had been the common ground for performers and audiences. After Dr. King was killed in Memphis, the long-standing professional and friendly relationships between musicians of different races suffered a rift that took years to heal. Beginning in 1962, as the house rhythm section for Stax Records, Booker T and the MGs played on a wide swath of the classic soul music that was recorded in Memphis. When they became a racially mixed group, with 2 black and 2 white members in 1965, the MGs epitomized the delicate balance between the races that shaped Memphis music. In my 1999 interview with Booker T and the MGs guitarist Steve Cropper, he talked about the King assassination. "I'm not sure Memphis will ever recover from that tragedy," he shared. "I can tell you that prior to that, as far as I know, there was never ever a problem with any color that came through the doors at Stax. Didn't happen. And after that, it was never the same." That same year, I also spoke with noted session keyboardist Marvell Thomas, who performed with Isaac Hayes and the Temptations, and was a member of a prominent black family of Memphis musicians. He is featured on many Stax recordings in the 1960s and 1970s. His father, Rufus Thomas, had the first successful releases for both Sun and Stax Records. His sister, Carla Thomas, was a major recording star as a teenager in the 1960s, and another sister, Vanice Thomas, is an in-demand singer, producer, and session vocalist. We sat in the historic Sam C. Phillips recording studio, where Marvell was very candid about race relations in Memphis. "You know, it was never a problem," he told me. "The problem, when it arose, was political because of the death of Martin Luther King, and for obvious reasons, although I think they're kind of stupid, people who had grown to trust each other and like each other over many years of working together suddenly became suspicious of each other because of that instance." The great paradox of Memphis music is that it transcends race and genre while simultaneously being defined by both. It is often the result of racial collaboration, but has its genesis in the collision of the races. Blacks and whites in Memphis have an interdependent relationship that dates from the yellow fever epidemics of the 1870s. Except for a short time following the assassination of Dr. King, harmony existed among Memphis musicians regardless of race. I'm about to tell a story of Memphis music. It is a story of a city and a culture that fosters independent thinking in the midst of a strict conservative society. There's a spirit of self-reliance in Memphis. It is born of the poverty and oppression shared by blacks and whites here, who have nothing to lose and everything to gain. This is not the ultimate comprehensive story of Memphis music. I've tried to set the scene for the events, personalities, and circumstances that led to Memphis's rightful recognition as a key capital on the map of American music. I hope it shows the cultural and sociological circumstances in which musicians dwelled as they developed their crafts. I also hope that it highlights the unique environment that nurtured and allowed those musicians to influence world culture in an unusual, perhaps disproportionate manner. My planning for this story began in the mid-1970s when I received a Younger Scholars Grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to study urban music in Memphis. Research continued from that point, accelerating in 1990 when the Smithsonian Institution hired me to schedule and conduct interviews as part of the team developing what became the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum. This book draws on over 40 years of research, including those interviews. Many notable artists, especially more contemporary ones, are either not mentioned in this book or given short shrift. To those deserving singers, songwriters, musicians, and promoters, I apologize. Any omission is indicative of my particular perspective in telling this story, and not the value of their contributions. Chapter 1. Mutual Admiration. And somebody said, "That's John Lennon." So I just laughed. Ann Peebles, soul singer. A story circulated among Memphis musicians a few years ago about Blair Cunningham, a member of a legendary family of local drummers who had moved to England to pursue his career. Cunningham's older brother, Carl, was a member of the original Bar-Kays and was killed in the airplane crash that claimed most of his bandmates and soul singer Otis Redding. According to the story, in the early 1990s, Blair was invited to try out for a new band being formed by Paul McCartney. He dutifully went to the former Beatles' estate, where he and Paul jammed alone together for a few hours, McCartney on guitar and Cunningham on drums. At the end of the session, the young drummer from Memphis told the bassist of the most successful rock band in history that they might have a good band if they could find a good bass player. Cunningham got the job and played with McCartney for a few years. The point of the story is not to disparage him for not knowing McCartney's background. He came from a family of musicians and certainly knew the Beatles' music. But musicians in Memphis were often enveloped in a cocoon of the region's great music. It was less important to those artists what other people were doing. What was being created in Memphis was what mattered. Growing up in Memphis in the 1950s and 1960s, I was unaware of any national significance of local racial, musical, or political issues. We were such a provincial city that it seemed unlikely that anything occurring here impacted the conversation in larger markets. The country was facing major changes in light of newly passed civil rights laws. The onslaught of mass media was making the world seem smaller, even if the South tried to hold on to its distinct regional culture. The expansion of national chains like McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Memphis-born Holiday Inn promised to erase any semblance of local flair to their products. Patrons were assured the same experience at these establishments regardless of geography, and kids nationwide were all hearing and dancing to the same music thanks to Dick Clark's American Bandstand. When Ed Sullivan first introduced Elvis Presley on September 9, 1956, and the Beatles on February 9, 1964, to primetime TV, the entire country took notice. Like many others, my family moved to the economically segregated suburbs when faced with the prospect of integrated neighborhoods. My childhood mirrored those of thousands of white kids across the country. The distinction was in the music that came from my hometown. By the time I entered junior high school in September 1964, the question was not, do you play an instrument, but rather, what instrument do you play? Certainly, part of this evolution of musicians was due to the influence of the Beatles. In fact, I began playing drums because of Ringo Starr. But there is a long Memphis tradition of children learning an instrument that precedes the British invasion. It's part of the culture. And in our bands in the 1960s, we played what we knew, which included what we heard from other local bands and popular music from the radio. At our proms and dances, we heard legendary African-American band leaders like Willie Mitchell and Gene Bowlegs Miller. On the radio, we listened to Rufus Thomas on WDIA, the first all-black station in the United States. As a teenager in Memphis, I assumed there was an Elvis Presley living in every town, or that some version of Charlie Rich or Ronnie Millsap played piano at local night spots. If you had a decent high school band like the Gentrys or the Box Tops, you could make a hit record at Chips Moman's American Sound Studio. Stax Records was our record label, and its stars were seen around town at the grocery stores or the Popular Tunes record shop. Booker T and the MGs did a free show at the Overton Park Shell, where the Memphis Country Blues Festival was held annually, and featured regional elder blues legends like Furry Lewis, Gus Cannon, Booka White, and others. Until I first moved away for college in 1970, I had no idea that there was anything different about Memphis. It was 1967, and popular music was in transition. Successful British newcomers The Who and U.S. expatriate Jimi Hendrix were bridging the divide and bringing their music to the States. Established English performers the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were expanding musical boundaries with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Their Satanic Majesty's Request, respectively. Meanwhile, the mainstays at Stax Records in Memphis really didn't have a sense of how far their music was reaching outside of their hometown. Otis Redding had visited the United Kingdom for a short tour in 1966, but the label's owner, Jim Stewart, was reluctant to have his house band, Booker T and the MGs, out of the studio for too long. The quartet played on most of the records made at the tiny studio in Memphis, and Stewart didn't want to shut down production for an extended period of time. Stax Vice President Al Bell felt there was an opportunity to increase overseas sales and favored the idea. Finally, Stewart planned a 13-show European tour beginning March 17th and running until April 9th, 1967. The review featured the label's most popular acts, anchored by Redding. The lineup also included Carla Thomas, the Marquis, Sam and Dave, Eddie Floyd, and Arthur Conley. Booker T and the MGs backed all the singers, and the horn section from the Marquis joined them to form the house band. Most of the participants were in their 20s and completely unaware of the worldwide following for their music. According to the Marquis trumpeter Wayne Jackson, "We didn't have any idea that we were making any impact, except the songs were going up and down the charts." The Stax Volt Tour of 1967 was the first time we got a chance to go overseas. "The big Stax show on the road," said saxophonist Andrew Love. "When we landed in England, we had limos provided by the Beatles. That's when we began to think, hey, maybe we're somebody." Before the review tour began, Carla Thomas played with Booker T and the MGs at a small club in London called Bag o' Nails. Beatle Paul McCartney showed up. Years later, she reminisced, "It was to get the practice, and it was a real intimate little place. Of course, that just made us feel really good that he came to see us, and we all sat at the table and talked to him, and he stayed the whole night, just until about the club closed. He was in awe. He was wonderful. It was just an exchange of mutual admiration." "I love you!" yelled the man in the audience. The diminutive soul singer with the big voice ignored the outburst. She was accustomed to rowdy admirers. After all, she had played in the clubs in Memphis, and this was the legendary Troubadour, one of the top showcase clubs in Los Angeles. She had dealt with hecklers before. What could go wrong? "I love you!" shouted the obviously intoxicated man again. This was Memphian Ann Peebles's big showcase. The Troubadour was the hot club in town where stars and music aficionados gathered, where careers could be launched and the elusive buzz could begin. Decades later, she told me in an interview, "I looked out in the audience and somebody just kept screaming my name and screaming, 'I love you, I love you.' And I kept looking and I was saying, 'Who is this?' I kept looking out and I saw him, but he had a sanitary napkin taped to his forehead, and he kept screaming and screaming. I said, 'Who is that?' And somebody said, 'That's John Lennon.' So I just laughed." It was 1974, and Lennon had moved to Los Angeles and begun an 18-month period of debauchery. He had gone to the Troubadour with friends to listen to Peebles. Her rendition of "I Can't Stand the Rain" had been released a year earlier, and Lennon had declared it to be the best song ever in Billboard magazine. That evening, he was inebriated and had slipped into the ladies' room, emerging with a sanitary napkin across his forehead. As the evening wore on, his declarations of admiration for the soul singer from Memphis grew more graphic. After the show, he came backstage and apologized to Peebles. "He came backstage and we had a long talk. He's a funny guy." 20th century music is a difficult art form to force into genres. Lines blur between blues, jazz, rock and roll, and R&B. Many of these terms are primarily marketing tools to help retailers and radio stations target consumers. Congress designated Memphis the home of the blues on December 15, 1977, probably because of the sheet music and early recordings of band leader W.C. Handy, whose contributions cannot be discounted. Likewise, New Orleans lays claim to its place as the birthplace of jazz, based on descriptions of the music played by early pioneer Buddy Bolden, whose renditions were not recorded. The reports of improvisation in his performances are a powerful harbinger of jazz. Truthfully, both cities' claims are probably not accurate, as the instrumentation and repertoire seemed similar between Handy's and Bolden's bands. In fact, music can seldom point to a singular event as its genesis. Even Elvis Presley's first rock recordings stemmed from his love of R&B. Handy's band read music and played a stricter, more formal style than Bolden's, but musicians and the black audiences likely traveled frequently between the two cities. Both are on the Mississippi River and offered jobs, entertainment, and a population that included the first generation of African Americans born after slavery was abolished. As American music developed, pockets of innovation existed in many U.S. cities, including clubs on Elm Street in Dallas and those on Decatur Street in Atlanta. But regional differences were often pronounced and led to distinct characteristics that shaped the progression of the music. Such was the case in Memphis. What is it about this small southern town that produced music that so enthralled the most famous musicians in the world? Why would both Paul McCartney and John Lennon, the most successful songwriters and musicians of that era, act like fawning fans of its artists? It's all part of the story of the music from Memphis. Chapter 2. Race Relations. Mrs. Moss, she went to jail, called on Judge DuBose. Judge DuBose came out and said, "Get right on away from here." Local song from 1892. The city of Memphis never had an exclusive on racism, despite its history as a major slave trading center. After all, enslaved people were sold and traded as property in many states in the South. But because of these historical atrocities committed by whites upon slaves, Southern whites and blacks have a different relationship than those who live elsewhere in the country. Marvell Thomas, Memphis musical family scion, said that the major difference between racism in the South as opposed to the North is that racism here has always been overt. Everybody knew where everybody stood on the subject. Historically, Southern whites and Southern blacks all grew up in an agrarian society. They knew each other because they worked in close contact with each other all the time. The kids grew up playing with each other on the farms and in the streets until they were teenagers. In the segregated North, there was less personal, social contact. As a river port, Memphis imported diverse regional influences and exported its innovations. Coupled with the ratio of blacks unable to leave Memphis to whites returning after the yellow fever epidemics in the 1870s, the dynamics were set for the intersection of African American and European American music and culture. There is a misconception that African American music is African music played by black Americans. While many of the instruments and techniques of African American music have a direct link to Africa, the music itself emerged from age-old African and European traditions as they endured in the United States. The banjo, fiddle, and the diddley bow can all be traced to Africa, while the saxophone, guitar, and the diatonic scale were European inventions. The diatonic scale, the basis for Western music, includes a mix of whole and half steps, which music students learn as do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. African American music has antecedents retained from slave music, talking drums, work songs, and chants, but as instruments were introduced after slavery was abolished, the music changed. In the South, the people freed from slavery introduced their African heritages to European-trained musicians, and conversely, learned European-devised musical concepts. Strangely enough, it was the racial imbalance in the relationship between black and white Memphians that allowed the music to evolve in a unique fashion. The story of music in Memphis is full of intersecting moments and the subsequent developments. There are heroes and bystanders, villains and victims, country bumpkins, and slick confidence men in a cast of characters that defines the independent spirit. Memphis, founded in 1819 and incorporated in 1826 with a population of 500, was poised to become a major southern metropolis. Named after the capital of ancient Egypt on the Nile River and situated on a bluff of the Mississippi River, the city grew rapidly over its first 5 decades until a series of yellow fever epidemics in the 1870s changed its trajectory. In 1850, black people were 28% of Memphis's total population of 8,841. By 1870, the population reached 40,226. However, following a yellow fever epidemic in 1873, the population had grown by only 4 people over 5 years. When the worst of the yellow fever epidemics hit Memphis in August 1878, the population shift began. In September of that year, 25,000 people.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?